16 Black actors who passed away not long after losing their spouse. There's a kind of loss that never makes it into an obituary headline. A career can be summarized in a paragraph: the awards, the iconic roles, the decades on screen, but the quiet unraveling that sometimes follows the death of a spouse rarely gets mentioned at all. For 16 Black actors whose faces once filled American living rooms and movie theaters, that unraveling became part of their story too. Some kept working for years afterward, channeling grief into their craft. Others faded from view almost immediately, as if the person who had anchored them to the world had taken something essential when they left. What connects all 16 of these performers is not just fame, and not just talent, but the experience of building a life alongside someone, losing that person, and then facing whatever came next, sometimes for decades, sometimes for only a matter of weeks. Here are their stories. Olivia Colman spent her career proving that discipline and craft could outlast the limited roles Hollywood usually offered Black actresses. Trained at Bard College and later at London's Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, she became the first Black performer to win an Emmy in her category for her role as Matilda in a landmark 1977 television miniseries about slavery that was watched by tens of millions of Americans. Her marriage to actor Richard Venture lasted 13 years before ending in divorce in the early 1980s, and she never remarried, eventually settling permanently in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, far from the industry that had once celebrated her. Venture went on to marry twice more before he died in December 2017 at the age of 94. Just over a month later, in January 2018, Olivia Colman died of a heart attack at her home in Mexico at 75. The two had been divorced for more than 3 decades, yet their deaths landed within weeks of each other. A coincidence that still stands out in her biography. Kim Hamilton, born Dorothy Mae Aiken, built a screen career that stretched across more than 60 years, including a role as Helen Robinson in the 1962 film adaptation of a novel about racial injustice in the American South. Her personal life took longer to settle. After 2 earlier marriages ended, she spent more than 2 decades in a relationship with actor Werner Klemperer, known for his role as a rigid commandant on a popular sitcom set during wartime, before the two finally married in 1997. Their marriage lasted only 3 years before Klemperer died in December 2000. Hamilton kept acting for years afterward, taking on television and film work well into the 2000s before eventually stepping back from the industry. She died in September 2013, just days after her 81st birthday, 13 years after losing the husband she had waited 2 decades to finally marry. Fredi Washington became one of the most recognized faces of the Harlem Renaissance, though her fame did not shield her from personal loss. Her first marriage, to trombonist Lawrence Brown, ended in divorce after nearly 20 years together. Her second marriage, to Connecticut dentist Hugh Anthony Bell, gave her almost 2 decades of a quieter life away from the film industry that had once typecast her narrowly. After Bell died in October 1970, Washington did not remarry. She had already left acting behind by the late 1930s to focus on activism and advocacy for Black performers, and she carried that work forward for nearly 24 more years after her husband's death, remaining active in civil rights circles until she died in June 1994 at the age of 90. Paul Robeson's life changed dramatically after the death of his wife, Eslanda Good, who had spent 4 decades as his manager, biographer, and closest political ally, giving up her own scientific ambitions to help build his career as an athlete-turned-lawyer-turned-performer. Their marriage endured real strain, including his affairs and years of government persecution during the Cold War that included a revoked passport and a period of exile. Eslanda was diagnosed with breast cancer, and the couple returned to the United States in 1963. She died in December 1965, just 2 days before her 70th birthday. Robeson moved in with his son's family afterward and withdrew almost entirely from public life. His health, already fragile, continued to decline, and he died in January 1976 in Philadelphia, having spent his final decade largely in seclusion. Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis built one of the most respected creative and political partnerships in Black entertainment history, performing together for decades while standing at the center of the civil rights movement, including hosting the March on Washington in 1963. Davis died suddenly in February 2005 while working on a film project, a loss that arrived without warning after more than 50 years of marriage. Rather than withdrawing, Dee continued working, earning an Academy Award nomination 2 years later for a performance in a crime drama at the age of 83. She died in June 2014 at 91, 9 years after losing Davis, and her ashes were placed in the same urn as his, fulfilling a wish the couple had documented together. Cicely Tyson's relationship with musician Miles Davis moved through cycles of closeness and separation for decades before the two finally married in 1981. The marriage brought glamour but also real strain tied to his struggles with addiction, and Tyson filed for divorce in 1988, choosing not to speak to him again after their split. Davis died in September 1991, roughly 2 years after the divorce was finalized, though Tyson later revealed he had reached out to apologize shortly before his death. She never remarried, continuing to deliver acclaimed performances well into her 80s and 90s and receiving honors that included a Presidential Medal of Freedom. She died in January 2021 at 96, nearly 30 years after Davis, and was buried beside him. Elena Reed Hall, known for her roles as Olivia on a beloved children's program and Rose Lee on a popular sitcom, married actor Kevin Peter Hall in December 1988. Kevin had contracted HIV following a blood transfusion after a car accident and was later diagnosed with AIDS-related pneumonia. He died in April 1991, just a few years into their marriage, during a period when public understanding of AIDS was still shaped heavily by fear and stigma. Elena carried that private grief while continuing to raise their children and work on screen. Nearly 17 years later, in 2008, she remarried, finding companionship in her final years. She died in December 2009 at 63 following a battle with breast cancer, roughly 18 years after losing Kevin. Zara Cully spent decades building a career in theater and drama instruction long before television ever noticed her, not becoming a household name until she was already in her 80s, playing George Jefferson's sharp-tongued mother on a hit sitcom. Long before that fame, she had married James M. Brown Sr. in 1914, and their marriage lasted more than 5 decades until his death in 1968. Rather than withdrawing, Cully kept working and teaching, eventually landing the role that introduced her to a new generation of viewers. She died in Los Angeles in 1978 at 86, 10 years after losing James, closing out a long and determined career built on decades of preparation. James Earl Jones married actress Cecilia Hart in 1982, and their marriage lasted more than 3 decades as they raised their son together while carefully shielding their home life from public view. Hart battled ovarian cancer before her death in 2016. Jones, already one of the most respected voices in American acting, appeared publicly less often in the years that followed, choosing quiet restraint over the spotlight that had defined much of his career. He died on September 9, 2024 at 93, 8 years after losing Cecilia, closing a life built on discipline and endurance. Eartha Kitt's story is often mistold as a tale of widowhood, but the timeline tells a different story. She married real estate businessman and Korean War veteran John William MacDonald in 1960, and their daughter was born the following year, but the marriage ended in divorce in 1964. MacDonald remained part of her history as someone who had been present during a formative period of her life, and he died in 2005, 3 years before Kitt herself. By then, she had already lived through multiple reinventions as a nightclub performer, recording artist, Broadway star, and political exile after publicly opposing the Vietnam War. She died from colon cancer on Christmas Day, 2008, not as a grieving widow but as a woman who had outlived an ex-husband and rebuilt her career again and again. Lena Horne married her longtime musical director, Lenny Hayton, in 1947, a union that crossed racial lines at a time when interracial marriage carried real danger. He remained her partner both on and off stage until his death in 1971, a loss that arrived during the same difficult period as the death of her son, Teddy. Horn had already spent decades pushing back against an industry that tried to contain her talent and her image. After losing Hayton, she did not disappear from public life, later returning with a celebrated one-woman stage show built from decades of hard-won experience. She died in 2010 at 92, nearly 4 decades after Hayton's death. Brock Peters married Dolores "Dee Dee" Daniels in 1961, and the couple raised a daughter together while he built a career spanning stage, film, television, and voice work, including his restrained, widely praised performance as Tom Robinson in a landmark 1962 courtroom drama. Dolores died in 1989 after a battle with cancer. Peters continued working for years afterward, later becoming familiar to new audiences through science fiction television and voice acting. He died of pancreatic cancer in 2005, 16 years after losing Dolores, leaving behind a body of work built on quiet dignity. Juanita Moore married Charles Burris, a Los Angeles bus driver outside the entertainment industry, and their marriage lasted roughly 50 years until his death in 2001. Moore had worked for years in small film roles before her breakout performance in 1959 as a mother whose daughter rejects her own identity, a role that earned her a rare Academy Award nomination for a Black actress of that era. Despite the nomination, Hollywood offered her limited opportunities afterward, and she continued working steadily in film, television, and theater, while also caring for Charles as his health declined. She died in 2014 at 99, more than a decade after losing Charles. LaWanda Page, born Alberta Peel, faced loss early and often. Public records indicate she was married and widowed multiple times over the course of her life, beginning when she was still a teenager, and she also lost a son in infancy. Long before television audiences knew her sharp tongue and fearless comic timing, she worked as a dancer, comedian, and nightclub performer. Fame arrived late, through a role in a popular 1970s sitcom as a Bible-quoting, insult-ready neighbor that made her instantly memorable. She died in 2002 from complications related to diabetes, having already survived the loss of multiple husbands and a child decades earlier. Diane Carroll's life changed suddenly in 1977 when her husband, magazine editor Robert DeLeon, died in a car accident just 2 years into their marriage. By then, Carroll was already a groundbreaking television and film star, known for a role that made television history and an Academy Award-nominated film performance. Rather than withdrawing after DeLeon's death, she returned to work. She later married singer Vic Damone, a marriage that also ended in divorce, but Robert's sudden death remained one of the most serious losses of her life. She died in 2019 at 84 after a battle with cancer, having lived through profound loss without ever letting it define her completely. Claudia McNeil married William Henry Smith while still a young woman, and public records suggest he died during World War II, leaving her to carry that grief quietly for years before Hollywood ever gave her a real opportunity. That private history shaped the depth she later brought to her most famous role, playing a mother holding her family together against poverty and racism in a landmark 1961 film adaptation opposite Sidney Poitier. She spent her final years at a nursing home for actors in New Jersey, away from the industry that had once celebrated her, and died in 1993 from complications related to diabetes. 16 careers, 16 very different marriages, and 16 very different ways of carrying loss. Some of these performers stepped back from the world almost entirely after losing a spouse. Others turned grief into some of the most acclaimed work of their careers, refusing to let a single loss define everything that came after. What stays consistent across all of their stories is something simple. The fame audiences saw was only ever half the picture. Behind it were real marriages, real partnerships, and real losses that shaped these actors just as much as any role they ever played.